From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Barry Seraphin in Tehran. The second in a 5-part special interview with the president. Tonight, a look at the future. Tom Jarriel in Chicago. And from our desk in Washington, Frank Reynolds.
Good evening. Day 1 of the 80s, day 59 of the seizure of the American embassy in Tehran and the captivity of American hostages. And today there was a violent demonstration at another embassy. Thousands of exiles from Afghanistan and some Iranians stormed the Soviet embassy to protest Russia's invasion of Afghanistan. We'll have a full report on this incident later in our broadcast. But now for the latest on the diplomatic front in Tehran, here is Barry Seraphin.
The new year brought a new effort at breaking the impasse in the hostage crisis here in Iran. United Nations Secretary General Kurt Waldheim arrived in Tehran this afternoon. But his prospects for success were not bright, and he was not promising any major or immediate breakthroughs. Jack Smith has details.
Waldheim first posed for photographs in the airport lounge with his host, Iran's Foreign Minister Sadegh Khatibzadeh. Then he talked about his mission.
And I shall certainly use this opportunity to explain my views to the authorities of Iran, and I'm very much looking forward to hear their views.
But Waldheim warned against optimism and hinted there could be other visits. And it looks like an uphill battle all the way. Ayatollah Khomeini, who could end the crisis if he wanted to, has shown no interest in seeing Waldheim. As for the students who hold the hostages, ABC News telephoned the U.S. Embassy this evening and talked to one of their spokesmen.
We haven't decided yet to let him in, and I think we won't let him in.
And if you did decide to let him in, would you negotiate with him?
No negotiation.
Foreign Minister Khatibzadeh, whom Waldheim will meet tomorrow morning, at a news conference this morning, laid down the significance of Waldheim's mission.
Only for the fact findings and nothing else.
Secretary General Waldheim has his work cut out if he's to meet the UN deadline in just 1 week. Jack Smith, ABC News, Tehran.
1 month ago, the chairman of the Democratic and Republican National Committees joined in a statement calling for support of the president in his attempts to free the hostages. Today, however, the Republican chairman, Bill Brock, issued a statement charging that Mr. Carter's policy of patience is one of deception, aimed at fooling the American people. Brock said that despite broad public support, Mr. Carter has failed to develop a policy that would protect American interests and prestige around the world. The White House had no immediate comment. In a moment, a report on today's developments in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
ABC's World News Tonight. Brought to you by Budweiser. For all you do, this Bud's for you.
There are reports today that Muslim insurgents and soldiers of Afghanistan's army have joined forces to fight the Russians in outlying areas of Afghanistan. The Soviets have now charged that the Muslim rebels have been trained and equipped by the CIA. More on Afghanistan now and the possible U.S. response from diplomatic correspondent Ted Koppel.
President Carter, according to a senior member of his administration, has been under tremendous pressure these past few days to take immediate and visible action against the Soviet Union. Tomorrow morning, the president meets on Afghanistan with his top national security advisors to make some decisions. Among the available options, seeking condemnation of Moscow at the United Nations, a coordinated U.S., European trade and credit crackdown against the Soviets, shipment of weapons and military materiel to Afghanistan's neighbor, Pakistan, the possibility of covertly channeling military supplies to Afghanistan's Muslim tribesmen, the re-examination of whether U.S. weapons should be sold to China. By coincidence, Defense Secretary Harold Brown leaves on a long-scheduled trip to Peking on Friday. And there is a proposal from Germany that's being considered for a multi-nation boycott of this summer's Moscow Olympics. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, there are already moves afoot for a joint Islamic reaction to the Soviet Union's invasion of predominantly Muslim Afghanistan. Ted Koppel, ABC News at the State Department.
There were more embassy demonstrations today, but for a change, they were not all at the U.S. Embassy. The Soviet Embassy got a taste of angry crowds too, although in this case, there was fast help from the Iranian government, as Bill Blakemore reports.
At the Russian embassy here in Tehran this morning, Afghani demonstrators expressed their anger about the Russian military occupation of Afghanistan. The Russian flag hauled down by the Afghanis, and for the first time given the same treatment the American flag has suffered in the past 2 months here. Death to Brezhnev, down with socialist imperialism, the crowds chanted in the familiar refrains usually shouted here against the United States. Some of these Afghani demonstrators told reporters their intention in this mid-morning melee was to occupy the Russian embassy. Any such plans were prevented by the warning shots fired in the air by Khomeini's young revolutionary guards, who were quickly called in. The young paramilitary guards themselves entered the Russian embassy compound and drove out any would-be occupiers. The Afghani demonstrators, mostly laborers and some of the many refugees from Afghanistan who've entered Iran in the past few months, remained for a while chanting at the gates, and then moved on to the American embassy 8 blocks away, where they expanded their chants to include Russia, China, America, all enemies of our countries. Bill Blakemore, ABC News at the Russian embassy in Tehran.
There was also a demonstration today in the city of Mashhad, near Iran's border with Afghanistan. According to one report, more than 5,000 Afghans took part in the protest and burned a Soviet flag. A final note on the Tehran demonstration. Iran's Foreign Minister Gopsadeh recently announced stepped-up security for foreign embassies here, saying such protection was the government's responsibility. That policy clearly applied to the Soviet embassy today. Gopsadeh insists, in view of Iran's grievances against the U.S., the continued occupation of the American embassy does not represent any contradiction in that policy. Frank?
Thank you, Barry. After a series of emergency meetings on Afghanistan, Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher returned to Washington tonight from Europe. Christopher met with members of the NATO alliance in Brussels yesterday and today. While no decisions were reached, the NATO countries have agreed that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is an extremely serious development. Tom?
Still ahead tonight, more killing in Rhodesia, where the British are trying to keep peace until elections, and a New Year's Eve ride into history on the Sierra Short Line.
It gives us no pleasure to remind you of this, but the new year brings with it a bigger federal tax bite. The Social Security tax, the FICA column on your paycheck, is going up. Last year, Social Security taxes came out of the first $22,900 of salary. This year, it's withheld from the first $25,900. In all, the maximum goes up $184 from $1,403 to $1,587. The minimum wage also goes up today from $2.90 an hour to $3.10. Tom?
Frank, 300 people were celebrating New Year's Eve in the town of Chapay in northern Quebec last night when fire broke out. 4 hours later, at least 41 were dead, more than 40 injured. Ann Jarriel has details.
The most seriously injured had to be airlifted from the remote mining town to hospitals several hundred miles away. The number of casualties is so high because the fire spread quickly and partygoers reportedly panicked as they tried to push their way out. But because no one is sure just who was among the more than 300 guests, local police say it could take days to identify the dead and the missing. Police expect the death toll to rise still higher as more bodies are uncovered in the rubble. The cause of the fire has yet to be determined. A 21-year-old man is being held for questioning. Ann Jarriel, ABC News.
In Reno, Nevada last night, a New Year's Eve celebration got out of hand as several thousand people went on a rampage through the downtown Casino Row. Some of the rioters carried anti-Iranian placards as they set fires and looted buildings. When it was all over, about 10 people had been injured, 100 arrested. Damage to one pawn shop alone exceeded $100,000. Not too far away from Reno, in the Sierra Nevada, New Year's Eve brought an end to an era in train travel. Stephen Gear was there as it went out in style.
From 1897 to 1938, steam engines like this one pulled little passenger trains like this one through the foothills of the Sierras in California's gold country. 9 years ago, the Sierra Railroad resumed passenger service, but only as a tourist attraction. Now, at the end of the decade, that too has apparently come to an end. For 7 years, the railroad has celebrated the arrival of the new year by transporting, wining, and dining steam train buffs from Jamestown, California, through the hills to Cooperstown and back. Last night's excursion was to be the last. A number of factors have brought an end to steam passenger service on the Sierra Short Line. Most important, the cost of oil. Many of the railroad's employees will be kept on. Diesel freight service will continue. But the fireman on last night's run was wringing out the old. And this engineer may never again have the pleasure of running under a full head of steam. But there is hope that the state of California may yet help revive the passenger operation.
We hope it will not be the last run. 3 other times we've gone out of the passenger business, but the railroad is still here, and hopefully something can happen again.
Although it's the price of oil that's putting passenger service on the Sierra Railroad out of business, this New Year's Eve special seems to be able to run on alcohol. Good old acquaintance, keep a good and never put to mind.
Last ride or not, the occasion seemed more festive than historic. The food was plentiful and good, and the bar was well stocked, at least at the beginning of the 4-hour, 44-mile round trip. Last night in the Sierras, we said farewell not only to 1979, but to some of the great sounds and sights and smells of our heritage. Stephen Gear, ABC News, Jamestown, California.
A ceasefire has supposedly been in effect in Rhodesia now for the last 4 days, but you would not know it from what happened there today. Rhodesian troops fought a group of guerrillas who reportedly attacked a farm 60 miles northwest of Salisbury. 7 of the guerrillas were killed. The job of keeping the Rhodesian army and the guerrillas apart during this ceasefire belongs to the British Army, but it's not easy, as Mark Coogan explains.
1980 gets underway at Camp Alpha, a British ceasefire outpost in the Zambezi Valley. It's an early start for Major Christopher Lahardy, the man in charge. And here are the people he must watch over, guerrillas of the Patriotic Front. Major Lahardy and 16 other British soldiers must keep the lid on at Camp Alpha for 2 months, until a new government of independence is elected in Rhodesia.
What about the safety of your men and yourself? Do you worry about that since there's so few of you and so many of them?
We are constantly aware of that, but we, in what I hope is a relaxed fashion, are keeping alert, and we will play it as it happens.
Already there are nearly 300 guerrillas around here, setting up tents for as many as 2,000 more who are expected. The guerrillas are allowed total access to their weapons. It's a ceasefire, not a surrender. The British role is to monitor, not keep the peace, a role unlike any they have undertaken before. Mark Coogan, ABC News, Camp Alpha, Rhodesia.
The ceasefire in Rhodesia represents a strong hope for an end to a war that has taken more than 20,000 lives in that country. And the ceasefire also represents one of the more important diplomatic achievements of the 1970s. The 70s were a decade of major international developments for the United States, both for good and bad. Tonight, Peter Jennings reviews some of these major international stories. Peter?
It was not the decade it started out to be. By 1973, everything looked different. A Middle East crisis, war again between Israel, Egypt, and Syria, became an oil crisis. And by the end of the decade, when the 7 industrial nations were meeting, it was clearly an economic crisis. In the eyes of a restless and troubled world overseas, it has been a decade in which a wasteful America has lost its clout and perhaps its will. America finally lost a war in Vietnam, and not since the late 1940s has communism enjoyed such a series of advances. Most spectacular was the whole of Indochina, but as the 1980s begin, the Soviet Union is consolidating in Afghanistan, and in between there was Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia. The other communist superpower, China, has emerged from the 70s more pragmatic and less isolated, but still fearing the Soviets. And what began with an American ping-pong team's visit in 1971 has developed into a Sino-American marriage of convenience. It has been the decade in which Washington and Moscow have lost exclusive rights to global influence. The oil-producing nations have influence undreamed of in the 1960s. The emerging Third World bloc has replaced America's virtual control of the United Nations. Overseas, the 1970s have seen terrorism raised to ugly and defective new forms. Palestinians led the way on a Jordanian desert in 1970. In their demand for recognition, they blew up empty aircraft. But worse was to follow. The massacre at Lod Airport outside Tel Aviv. Munich, where once again the actions of a few paralyzed the many, and other groups learned quickly. In quiet northern Holland, South Moluccans captured trains and hostages. They did not regain their homeland, but they too had their questionable moment in the sun. Any portrait of the 1970s must be heavily daubed with violence. Almost 2,000 people have been killed in Northern Ireland. The IRA murdered Earl Mountbatten, the Queen's cousin. The IRA and Italy's Red Brigade threatened the 1980s. The Red Brigade killed the former Italian Premier Aldo Moro. Gang names became household names. The Red Brigade, the Japanese Red Army, the Baader-Meinhof in West Germany. It has been, abroad, more than at home, a decade of insecurity. There were coups and attempted coups in more than 100 countries. 40 prime ministers, presidents, and heads of state were deposed. The passing of some was roundly applauded. Uganda's Idi Amin spent 8 bloody years at the top before Tanzanian-led rebels overthrew him. Pol Pot was run out of Phnom Penh by the Vietnamese, but he decimated the ancient Cambodian nation first. Oh, there were some happy moments in the 70s. 3 Americans in a balloon crossed the Atlantic, and Queen Elizabeth was still the most admired woman after 25 years on the throne. Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem, but it is only a ray of peace, and it only shines on Egypt and Israel. In the 1970s, Louise Brown became the world's first test tube baby, and one of the more than 700 million new children who swelled the world's population to more than 4 billion. At the end of this year of the child, millions of them are starving, for it has been a decade of drought, flood, and famine. And it has again been a decade of human neglect. The fates and fortunes of world leaders were no small part of the decade's history. President Nasser died, and an era in the Arab world came to an end. Golda Meir died, still fretful. She had almost lost the 1973 war. King Faisal was assassinated by a deranged nephew, and Pakistan's President Bhutto was hung by his successor, President Zia, in the dead of night. Mao Zedong died, and his influence wanes. Zhou Enlai, the more worldly Chinese leader, remains revered in death. Generalissimo Franco died, and Spain started down the road to democracy. Charles de Gaulle died peacefully. Park Chung-hee was murdered, and so was Chile's Salvador Allende. Some fell only to rise again. Indira Gandhi lost her job as Indian Prime Minister, but despite her onslaught against Indian democracy, she may soon be Prime Minister again. If the American flag was rather tattered at the beginning of the decade, by the end it was in flames. The outrage in Tehran continues, and its ripples through the Islamic world may yet become the waves of the 1980s. It is perhaps ironic that at the end of this decade, the United States should be so captivated by 2 foreign men of religion. John Paul II is the first non-Italian pope in 400 years, a courageous Polish fighter for human rights and freedom in a context Americans have easily understood. And there is the Ayatollah Khomeini.
President Carter talked about his hopes for the coming decade in this country during an interview yesterday in the Oval Office of the White House. As you will see, the president is optimistic.
Mr. President, we're now entering a new year, a new decade. You're the leader of our country.
Yes.
What do you foresee for the United States in the 80s? Our greatest opportunity, let's say.
I think it'll be a good decade. I see a nation with growing strength, economically, politically, militarily, and I hope morally and ethically. I see a nation that increasingly will be exerting a beneficial influence on the rest of the world for stability and for peace, for the enhancement of human rights. I'd like to see the American people more unified. I'd like to see them accommodate these rapidly changing circumstances that impose limits on us for the first time. We don't any longer have an unlimited reservoir of cheap energy to waste. In my opinion, that need not cause the American people's quality of life to be reduced. I'd like to see families strengthened. I'd like to see a return to the American people's consciousness, a greater trust and respect for their own government, based on the fact that the government tells them the truth and does not avoid controversial issues when the people know those issues to be important. I think it's also a trend that I intend to enhance, to let decisions be made by the American people closer to home, to decrease the intrusion of the federal government into the affairs of the American people, to strengthen local government and state government, and to let there be an easy exchange of communication. I would like to see also the elimination of remaining discrimination in our country against women and against blacks and against Hispanics and against the poor. I don't see any reason why these hopes and expectations won't be realized. Our country has such a tremendous innate strength. We've been blessed with unlimited reservoir of natural and human resources, and I think the expenditure of those in a proper way can let us accommodate those limits being imposed upon us on the one hand without a corresponding reduction in the enjoyment and quality of life on the other. These are major challenges. The American people must be courageous, and they must be well informed, and they must be involved in the process to an increasing degree. There's nothing easy about it, and anyone who tells the American people that there's some panacea, some automatic solution for problems, is just simply misleading them. But my assessment of the judgment and the maturity of the American people is very high.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'll have more of the President's interview tomorrow and every day this week on World News Tonight. Tomorrow, the President will discuss politics. And tonight, we'll have another special report on the crisis in Iran. Tonight's broadcast will be at 11:30, 10:30 Central Time. That's our report for now on World News Tonight. For ABC News, Happy New Year and good night.